Under the unforgiving glare of the spotlights at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, on the night of March 20th, 1982, Jerry Lewis's body shuddered before a transfixed audience, before collapsing heavily against the wooden stage. The muffled thud of the impact, drowned out by the sharp crack of the microphone hitting the floor, did not bring silence, but a deafening explosion of laughter that echoed off the crimson velvet walls of the showroom. To the hundreds of spectators who paid small fortunes to see the king of comedy, that collapse was not a medical tragedy, but the climax of a brilliant choreography, a calculated spasm of a master of physical comedy who had dedicated his life to turning gravity into a joke. While cold sweat trickled beneath heavy makeup and the stage lights turned the room into a claustrophobic furnace, Jerry remained motionless, his face pressed against the confetti-strewn floor, feeling the world spin in a spiral of indescribable agony that no one there was able to see. The atmosphere was saturated with the smell of expensive whiskey, cigar smoke, and the sweet perfume of the women in the front row, creating a cruel contrast with the metallic scent of fear emanating from the fallen artist. The mood of collective euphoria prevented the audience from noticing a somber detail. Jerry's right hand, once so expressive, was now contracting in an involuntary spasm, while his eyes, bulging behind his lenses, desperately sought a pocket of oxygen amidst the sonic chaos of the laughter. Every clap from the audience sounded like a hammer striking his spine, where a vertebra fragmented years ago had finally decided to claim its ultimate price, paralyzing the man the world believed was made of rubber. In that fraction of a second, the invisible border between a brilliant performance and a human collapse completely disappeared, leaving behind only the shadow of a genius who, while trying to save the show, had just lost his own physical foundation in front of everyone. Before we head backstage on this fateful night, if you want more powerful and deep stories like this, comment your opinion below, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue bringing you intense reports. Las Vegas in the early 80s was the global epicenter of a decadent glamour, where the neon never rested and the sound of slot machines served as the soundtrack for lost fortunes and inflated egos. At the center of this electric whirlwind was Jerry Lewis, a force of nature who had shaped modern comedy with his elastic mannerisms and inexhaustible energy. He was not just a comedian. He was an American institution, the king of comedy, whose mere presence on a stage guaranteed a sold-out house and an adoration bordering on religious fanaticism. The audience didn't just expect jokes, they expected the impossible, that a middle-aged man would continue to hurl himself against walls and fall down staircases with the same reckless lightness of a cartoon character. However, behind the velvet curtains and monumental marquees, Jerry's emotional state was a mosaic of anxiety and a pathological need for approval that consumed him like a silent acid. The mask of the genius of laughter hid a deeply lonely man, whose identity was so fused with his character that he no longer knew where the artist ended and the human being began. Jerry lived in a perpetual cycle of adrenaline and exhaustion, driven by a visceral fear of becoming irrelevant in an industry that discards its idols as quickly as cards are swapped at a blackjack table. He felt the weight of every passing year, but refused to slow down, believing that his value as a person was intrinsically linked to his ability to elicit laughter, whatever the cost. The social scene around him was one of pure ostentatiousness, with celebrities and mobsters sharing the same chilled air conditioning, while Jerry prepared for each performance like a gladiator entering the arena. To him, the stage was the only place where the chaos of the world made sense, even if that sense was anchored in a dangerous lie. To maintain this facade of immortality, Jerry turned to concrete details that made up his survival routine, such as the constant use of disguised orthopedic shoes and a rigorous diet of medications he hid in vitamin bottles. Since a traumatic accident in 1965 during a performance at the Sands Hotel, when he fell off a piano and fractured a vertebra, his spine had become a battlefield of inflamed nerves and worn bones. He carried consistent temporal marks of pain with him, remembering every date his body failed, yet his mind forced him to continue. Jerry's biological clock ticked at a very different hour than the one displayed on the gold watches in the casinos, while the city celebrated the eternal night. He counted the minutes until the next pill that would allow him to stand for another 60 minutes before the spotlights. The credibility of his comedy depended on his ability to hide his human fragility under layers of charisma. The initial conflict of that night in 1982 was not just physical, but a spiritual war between the artist's duty and the agony of an organism begging for mercy. Jerry looked into the dressing room mirror and saw the wrinkles of fatigue that makeup tried to erase, feeling an invisible pressure in his chest that went far beyond simple opening night jitters. He knew the audience out there didn't want to see a sick or vulnerable man. They wanted the indestructible clown who defied the laws of physics for their entertainment. This relentless expectation acted as a force of authority over his will, pushing him beyond reasonable limits and silencing the alerts his brain sent through sharp stabs in his back. The starting point for disaster was set: an obstinate man, an insatiable audience, and a body that could no longer sustain the weight of its own legend, all about to collide on a Las Vegas stage. The exact moment of the rupture occurred when Jerry, in the middle of a frantic physical comedy bit, attempted a rotational maneuver his body could no longer process. As he pivoted on his left axis, a distinct snap echoed internally, as if a dry tree branch had snapped under the weight of snow, and an electric shock of agony shot from the base of his spine to the base of his skull. The balance that had been his tool of the trade for decades vanished instantly, and the horizon of the stage tilted violently. Jerry didn't fall in the comedic sense that made him famous. He collapsed like a structure whose foundations had been imploded, hitting the floor with an inertia that stole all the air from his lungs. It was a total breakdown of the initial equilibrium, a point of no return where gravity finally defeated the genius who had challenged it for so long. The narrative turn was immediate and cruel, as the audience's perception did not keep pace with the gravity of the organic event. While Jerry felt the metallic taste of blood in his mouth and a cold paralysis rising through his legs, the crowd interpreted that brutal impact as the best gag of the night. The incident was presented clearly to the eyes of those watching: a comedian doing what he does best, surrendering his body to entertainment. However, for Jerry, the world had turned into a narrow, dark tunnel where the sound of laughter seemed to come from miles away. He tried to brace his hands on the floor to get up, but his fingers did not respond, remaining splayed against the cold wood while sweat flooded his eyes, turning the ceiling lights into blurred and threatening spots. The key event set the theme of the cost of the mask in motion irreversibly, exposing the hidden fragility of the icon. Jerry Lewis, the man who commanded crowds with a simple raise of an eyebrow, was now reduced to a mass of silent pain, internally begging for someone to notice that this was not a joke. The clarity of that fall was absolute for his nervous system. Something had broken permanently. The character was in motion, no longer toward the next round of applause, but toward the abyss of his own mortality. The invisible curtain separating health from illness had been torn, and the inciting incident made it clear that from that second on, Jerry Lewis's life would never return to the status quo of carefree glory that had defined him. Backstage, the stage manager and assistants began to exchange uncertain glances, as the length of time Jerry remained on the floor had exceeded the usual comedic timing. The transition from farce to panic began to manifest on the faces of those who knew Lewis's routine by heart, realizing that the void in the action was not being filled by the expected triumphant return to the microphone. The incident ruptured the fabric of the performance and forced raw reality into an environment built on illusion. Jerry was trapped in his own skin, a prisoner of his fractured vertebra, while the audience continued to laugh, feeding off the pain he could no longer hide. It was the beginning of a somber journey, where the laughter of others would become the background noise of his most painful and transformative fall. Is the price of entertainment worth the destruction of a man before our very eyes? What would you do if your life depended on a fake smile? Leave your comment now. The fall on stage was not the end of that night, but the beginning of a technical and biological nightmare that would drag on for years. As Jerry lay there, the seconds stretched like rubber, and silence began to seep into the cracks of the laughter, creating a palpable tension in the saturated Las Vegas air. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drum screaming for help while his mind tried, in vain, to send commands to his inert legs. In that moment, the king of comedy was just a vulnerable man, watching the dust dance under the spotlights, wondering if this would be his final act before an audience that still expected the impossible. The transition to chaos was abrupt. The heavy velvet curtain dropped like a guillotine, cutting off the audience's view and plunging Jerry into a hurried backstage gloom. Offstage, the Vegas glamour evaporated to make way for medical urgency and the panic of assistants rushing toward the prostrate body. The sound of laughter muffled by the curtain still echoed, but what Jerry heard now was the snap of latex gloves and the tense murmurs of paramedics trying to stabilize him without causing further damage. He was lifted onto a stretcher, feeling every inch of his spine protest with stabs of fire, while his peripheral vision caught the terrified faces of his production crew. The contrast was violent. Moments earlier he was the master of joy, and now he was fragile cargo being transported through narrow, dimly lit hallways. The smell of tobacco from the showroom was replaced by the antiseptic odor of the ambulance, marking the end of an era of physical denial. In the days that followed, Jerry's introspection became his private cell, where he confronted his own mortality and the fear of never walking again without help. He spent hours in silent hospital rooms, where the only soundtrack was the rhythmic beep of monitors, a constant reminder of his organic fragility. His mind revisited every choreographed fall, every leap off pianos, and every tumble down staircases that had cemented his fame, now realizing the accumulated cost of every laugh. He saw himself as an architect who built a palace of laughter on a foundation of broken bones, and the structure had finally buckled under the weight of glory. Doubts about his life's purpose began to erode his self-confidence, turning the genius into a melancholy observer of his own decay. The medical discovery was a devastating blow. An old fracture at the base of the spine, aggravated by decades of impact, had become a chronic source of neuropathic pain. To the doctors, it was a miracle that Jerry could still move. To Jerry, it was the beginning of a chemical dependency that would become his greatest prison. In Percodan, an extremely potent painkiller, he found the only way to silence the constant scream of his nerves, creating a love-hate relationship with the small white pill. The substance promised to return to the stage, but demanded his mental clarity and emotional stability as the price. He was now on a tightrope between artistic functionality and the abyss of medication overdose, hiding the addiction as if it were a state secret. The micro-scenes of his routine turned into rituals of concealment, where Jerry hid pill bottles inside expensive cigar boxes or in secret pockets of his tuxedos. He feared that if the audience knew of his pain, the comedy would lose its luster, turning laughter into pity, something his ego could never accept. The shock of seeing himself dependent on a substance for simple tasks, like brushing his teeth or hugging his children, created a wall of isolation between him and the outside world. He smiled for the cameras during the day, keeping the Jerry Lewis persona intact, but collapsed in tears and tremors as soon as his bedroom door closed. The duality between public brilliance and private darkness was becoming unsustainable, like a dam about to burst. Moments of tension arose when the medication's effect wore off sooner than expected, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in the middle of interviews or important rehearsals. Cold sweat would break out on his forehead, and his thinking became sluggish, forcing him to improvise excuses to withdraw and seek his dose of chemical relief. In these smooth transitions into isolation, he felt the weight of the symbolism of his career. The man who made everyone laugh was now crying alone, a hostage to a plastic bottle. He began to see his trophies and awards as reminders of a debt he could never fully repay. The cliffhanger of his life was constant. He never knew if the next dose would be enough, or if it would be the one that took him into definitive oblivion. Jerry's fragility manifested in subtle gestures, like the trembling of his hands when holding a glass of water or the hesitation before sitting in an ordinary chair. He developed an almost mystical sensitivity to the symbolic objects around him, such as the microphone, which he now saw as a scepter of simultaneous pain and glory. The stage, once his sanctuary, came to be seen as a minefield where any wrong move could trigger a new spinal catastrophe. The ambiguity of his situation was torturous. He loved the audience, but hated the expectation that audience placed on his physical body. He felt like a traitor to himself, feeding a legend that was slowly killing him from the inside, while the world asked for one more show. The development of Jerry's personal narrative dived into even murkier waters when suicidal thoughts began to emerge as a permanent solution to temporary pain. He looked at his collection of firearms and saw in them a quick exit from the daily torture his spine imposed on him, questioning if the world would miss the man or just the character. The emotional pressure was a constant white noise in his ears, preventing him from finding peace even in moments of great financial or professional success. He was on top of the world, but felt that the floor beneath his feet was made of brittle glass. The search for meaning in so much suffering became his new obsession, leading him to question if his art was worth the sacrifice of his soul. Every new performance was an act of resistance and despair, where Jerry injected massive doses of charisma to disguise the lethargy caused by the opioids he consumed. He observed other artists with a mixture of envy and contempt, feeling like a war veteran surrounded by civilians who didn't understand the cost of a single laugh. The narrative clarity of his life was being lost in a fog of medication and chronic fatigue, where days merged into one another without distinction. He began to distance himself from friends and close collaborators, fearing that his bloodshot eyes and volatile mood would reveal the truth about his condition. The genius of humor was becoming a ghost of himself, haunting the hallways of his mansion like an apparition. The transition toward the discovery of a possible cure came through a chance meeting with a pain specialist who introduced him to an experimental technology, the spinal stimulator. It was a symbolic object of hope, a pacemaker for pain that promised to return control of his own nervous system through electrical impulses. To Jerry, the idea of having an electronic device implanted in his body was both terrifying and fascinating, representing the final fusion between man and machine. He saw in it a chance for redemption, an opportunity to break the chemical chains that had held him prisoner to Percodan for decades. The decision to undergo surgery was the first gesture of real courage he had taken in years, away from the spotlights and the applause. While waiting for the date of the procedure, Jerry went through a process of internal purification, trying to reconcile with the past and the falls that brought him there. He looked at the recordings of his old films and no longer saw comedy, but the trail of a man who offered himself in sacrifice on the altar of entertainment. This realization brought deep sadness, but also a liberating clarity about the need to change his personal narrative from victim of art to survivor of life. He began to document his struggle, realizing that his story of pain could be just as impactful as his jokes if he had the courage to be honest. The urgency to live without the mask of perfection became his primary engine, pushing him toward the final confrontation with his own demons. The final micro-scenes of this period show a silent Jerry Lewis watching the sunset in Las Vegas from his hotel balcony, without the need to pull a face or tell a joke. He felt the weight of the device that would soon be part of his body, wondering if electricity could truly heal what chemistry only numbed. The tension between the fear of failure and the hope for a cure created a silent internal climax that needed no dramatic music to be felt. He was ready for the big turn, not for a new movie role, but for the most difficult role of his career, himself. The stage was set for the final act, where the truth would finally be revealed, whatever the cost to his reputation of immortality. At this point, it is impossible not to wonder, do we all carry invisible pain while trying to make the world smile? What would you be willing to sacrifice to be free of your own mask? Comment here. The surgery was a turning point, a moment of collision between exhausted biology and restorative technology, where Jerry faced the scalpel with the same determination he faced a hostile audience. The recovery period was marked by small daily cliffhangers, such as the first step without sharp pain or the first night of deep sleep without the need for painkillers. He felt the electricity run through his spinal cord like a tingling of new life, a constant reminder that he had survived his own fall. The discovery that he could be loved without needing to destroy himself physically was the greatest revelation of his journey, permanently changing his perspective on fame. He was no longer the clown who fell to amuse, but the man who stood up to inspire. The smooth transition to his new life mission began when he decided to use his platform to speak openly about chronic pain and the danger of opioid addiction. He realized that his vulnerability was his greatest strength, and that by exposing his wounds, he healed the wounds of thousands of people suffering in silence. The ambiguity of his career gave way to a clarity of purpose, where every word spoken in public carried the weight of a lived truth. He used his charisma no longer to mask agony, but to illuminate the shadows of a healthcare system that often ignores human suffering behind statistics. Jerry Lewis was becoming a symbol of resilience, proving that the end of a show does not mean the end of a life. Finally, Jerry began to feel comfortable in his own aging skin, accepting the marks of time and the scars of surgeries as medals of honor. He no longer felt the pathological need for constant approval, finding peace in the stillness and the company of those who truly knew him. The symbolic object of his transformation, the spinal stimulator, was now an integral part of who he was, a silent reminder that pain can be controlled, but the will to live is uncontrollable. Jerry's motivations had shifted drastically. He no longer wanted to be the greatest comedian in the world. He wanted to be the most authentic man he could be. The narrative of his life was reaching a powerful conclusion, where laughter and tears finally walked hand in hand. The transitions between his old personas and his new identity were marked by moments of deep introspection, where he recognized that comedy had been his salvation and his curse simultaneously. He understood now that the paradox of the sad clown was not an inevitability, but a choice he no longer had to make every day. The narrative clarity of his story was complete, revealing an arc of transformation that went from physical denial to spiritual acceptance. He was ready to take the stage one last time, not to fall and make people laugh, but to stand and tell the naked truth about what it means to be human under the unforgiving glow of fame. The show must go on, but this time, without the lie that almost destroyed him completely. Jerry Lewis's dramatic escalation reached a point of no return when chemical isolation began to dismantle his perception of reality, turning the mansion where he lived into a mausoleum of past glories. The emotional weight of the narrative became suffocating. Every invitation for a new public appearance was met with a mixture of terror and nausea, as he knew the stash of Percodan in his cabinet was dwindling as fast as his sanity. The urgency was no longer about the success of the next film, but about maintaining a physiology that screamed for help in every simple movement, such as the act of getting out of bed. He saw himself trapped in a cycle of biological injustice, where the man who taught the world to laugh could not find a single reason to smile in his own intimacy, feeling like an imposter beneath the impeccable tuxedo that hid a body in shambles. Revelations about the depth of his addiction began to leak through the pores of his public life, manifesting in inexplicable fits of rage and periods of sepulchral silence that frightened his closest collaborators. The emotional pressure was amplified by the realization that the audience, that amorphous mass he loved so much, was the same executioner demanding his self-destruction in exchange for applause. Jerry began to connect the events of his career with a growing sense of fatalism, realizing that the mask he had created had become a parasite feeding on his own health. The urgency of a definitive solution became a constant shadow, an invisible presence that accompanied him to every gala dinner and every telethon taping, reminding him that the time for pretending was coming to a violent and inevitable end. The pressure increased with every step he tried to climb, literally and metaphorically, as neuropathic pain spread like fire through his limbs, defying even the largest doses of medication. Jerry felt he was being crushed between the myth of being indestructible and the reality of a man contemplating his own end in a pill bottle. The building of expectation for the culminating moment did not come from a desire for glory, but from an existential weariness that made him long for truth above any applause. He began to see the lights of Las Vegas not as stars of success, but as the sparks of a fire he himself had started, and that now threatened to consume everything he had built over decades of grueling work. There was a sense of urgency in his quest for redemption that transcended the fear of death. Jerry feared, above all, dying as a lie, remembered only for his faces and not for the man who bled behind them. The injustice of his condition lay in the fact that his tool of trade, his body, was now his greatest enemy, a prison of bones and nerves that systematically betrayed him. He spent sleepless nights walking with difficulty through dark hallways, whispering to the walls about the revelation he needed to make, but which the entertainment industry did not seem ready to hear. The emotional pressure of sustaining the Teleton, raising millions for children with muscular dystrophy, while he himself withered in secret, created a moral paradox that pushed him to the brink of a nervous breakdown. The connection between his past choices and present suffering became an obsession, leading him to mentally relive the 1965 accident as the moment he sold his soul to the devil of entertainment. He felt that every laugh collected since then was a loan with predatory interest that his body was now being forced to pay back all at once. The dramatic escalation reached its peak when he realized that the next fall would not be a choreography, but the definitive end of his existence if he did not change the course of his story. The expectation of a public revelation began to grow within him like a physical necessity, a suffocated cry that needed a stage, but a stage where he could, for the first time, be just Jerry. In the final moments leading up to his decision to go public, the weight of the injustice of living in hiding became greater than the fear of audience rejection. He looked at his trembling hands and saw the reflection of millions of others who suffered from invisible pain, realizing that his voice could be the echo of a collective struggle. Emotional pressure turned into a mission, and the urgency to expose the truth became the only fuel left in his exhausted engine. The climax was near, not as an entertainment event, but as an act of public exorcism that would forever change the perception of what it means to be an icon. Jerry Lewis was ready to let the clown die so that the man could finally breathe without the weight of an iron mask. The climax of this trajectory did not occur with a joke, but with a deafening silence that paralyzed the entertainment industry when Jerry Lewis finally decided to remove the mask. Before the cameras and an audience that expected the usual histrionic humor, he revealed his pale face, eyes watery with exhaustion, and a voice trembling for the first time in decades of a public career. There was no luxurious set or rehearsed choreography, just a man stripped of his gimmicks, admitting that every laugh the audience released over the years was paid for with the price of his own physical and mental integrity. It was the moment of the great moral turn, where the genius of laughter confessed to being a prisoner of Percodan addiction, exposing the open wound of a spine destroyed by the insatiable desire to please an audience that never knew the man behind the character. The central scene was charged with an almost unbearable emotional tension, as Jerry did not ask for pity, but demanded recognition for the invisible pain that afflicts millions of people. He described, with cutting clarity, how the spotlights masked the cold sweat of withdrawal, and how applause functioned as a temporary anesthetic for a soul screaming for help. The most important symbolic gesture of his narrative happened when he pointed to his own spine and declared that true physical comedy was, in fact, a biological tragedy in slow motion. The audience, once accustomed to consuming his energy without questioning its origin, was forced to face the mirror of their own involuntary cruelty, realizing that entertainment often feeds on the flesh and spirit of the artist until nothing remains but a shadow. Unforgettable and emotionally rewarding, the climax revealed the strength of a Jerry that no one knew, the Jerry who found courage in absolute vulnerability. The revelation that he had implanted a spinal stimulator, a pacemaker for pain, served as the great payoff of his struggle against a treacherous biology, symbolizing his transition from victim to technological survivor. The tension that had dominated his life for 30 years seemed to dissipate in that testimony, turning the king of comedy into a beacon of brutal honesty in a world built on appearances and convenient lies. He no longer needed to fall to be noticed. His standing, firm and sober before the judgment of the world, was the most powerful and authentic performance of his entire existence, sealing his fate as a human icon. The great turn occurred when the world stopped laughing at him and began to feel with him, creating an empathetic connection that transcended any television sketch. The climax was the culmination of a life of denial that finally found peace through confession, proving that redemption is possible even after the deepest and most painful falls. Jerry Lewis ended that moment not with a catchphrase, but with the dignity of someone who had reclaimed possession of his own story, making it clear that pain may have shaped his career, but it would not define his end. It was the closing of a cycle of torture and the beginning of a new era, where the naked truth became his greatest work of art, echoing far beyond the stages of Las Vegas. The direct consequences of this public outburst were felt like a silent earthquake that reorganized Jerry Lewis's priorities and forever altered his relationship with the environment of show business. He was no longer just the rubber comedian, but the human face of chronic pain, a title he began to carry with more pride than any gold statuette accumulated on his shelf. The climax freed Jerry from the obligation to be perfect, allowing him to walk the hallways of his life without the weight of the chemical mask that had been suffocating him for decades. His understanding of the theme of fame changed radically. He realized that true immortality did not come from an easy laugh, but from the courage to expose the scars that all of us, in one way or another, try to hide from the world. The emotional closure of the narrative showed a Jerry Lewis slower in his movements, but infinitely more agile in his peace of mind, finding a new purpose in his life's mission. He began dedicating his remaining days to educating the public and the medical profession about the dangers of silent dependency and the importance of empathy in the face of other suffering. The Las Vegas environment, once a battlefield of egos and pain, transformed into a setting for reconciliation, where he could take the stage just to share his wisdom, without the need to sacrifice his spine for an encore. The humanity he recovered by admitting his fragility became his greatest legacy, conveying a message that vulnerability is, in fact, the highest form of resistance and character. The resolution of his life story brought a deep reflection on what truly matters when the spotlights go out and the sound of applause dissipates into the cold night air. Jerry Lewis, the man who nearly destroyed himself to keep the show alive, finally learned to enjoy silence and sobriety, living his final years with a clarity that Percodan had never allowed. He proved that redemption is not a single event, but a daily choice to remain standing, facing reality with his own eyes and his own body, without chemical crutches. In the end, the image of Jerry was no longer that of a sad clown fallen on the floor, but of a man of integrity who, after so many choreographed falls, discovered that the most heroic gesture of all is simply refusing to fall one more time. Jerry Lewis's trajectory teaches us that the mask we use to please the world can become the prison that prevents us from being saved, revealing that the true tragedy is not in the suffering, but in the silence surrounding it. He proved that the genius of laughter was, above all, a master of resilience, capable of transforming his deepest agony into a cry of freedom that still echoes on the stages of the human soul. His fall in 1982 was not the end of a career, but the birth of a truth that entertainment often tries to erase, that behind every brilliant performance, there is a human heart that bleeds, hopes, and desperately seeks to be understood in its totality. In the end, Jerry Lewis's courage lay not in the death-defying stunts, but in the humility to show that he was as mortal as every one of us in the audience. The true physical comedy of his life was the Herculean effort to remain standing when everything pushed him toward the abyss, leaving us with the definitive lesson that the brightest light can only be seen when we have the courage to face our own darkness. And in your opinion, what does this story reveal about the weight of wearing a smile for the world while crying inside? How far would you go to maintain the appearance of strength before those you love? Leave your comment. And in your opinion, what does this reveal about the character and difficult choices of those who live for the public? Leave your comment.